Well, here's one measure of their badness. You can try this at home. Ask yourself, is any news organization you know of so corrupt that it's willing to hurt you on behalf of its biggest advertisers? Anyone who do that is obviously Pablo Escobar level corrupt and should not be trusted. What would that look like? That level of corruption. Well, imagine that the Trump administration had made it mandatory for American citizens to buy MyPillow. That's one of Fox News' biggest advertisers. Imagine the administration declared that if you didn't rush out and buy at least one MyPillow and then at least another booster pillow, you would not be allowed to eat out. You couldn't re-enter your own country. You couldn't have a paying job. MyPillow, they told you with a straight face, was the very linchpin of our country's public health system. Now imagine as they told you that Fox, as a news organization, endorsed it, amplified the government's message. Imagine if Fox News attacked anyone who refused to buy MyPillow as an ally of Russia, as an enemy of science. And then imagine that Fox kept up those libelous attacks even as evidence mounted that MyPillow caused heart attacks, fertility problems, and death. If Fox News did that, what would you think of Fox News? Would you trust us? Of course you wouldn't. You would know that we were liars. Thank heaven Fox News never did anything like that, but the other channels did. The other channels took hundreds of millions of dollars from big pharma companies, and then they shilled for their sketchy products on the air. And as they did that, they maligned anyone who was skeptical of those products. At the very least, this was a moral crime. It was disgusting, but it was universal. It happened across the American news media. They all did it. So at this point, the question isn't who in public life is corrupt, too many to count. The question is, who is telling the truth?
We're talking about not just these, incredible censorship apparatuses that have been pulled up over the last years, and people losing their ability to kind of communicate their ideas in the public square. There's something more pernicious, and that's a loss of the idea or the need or the drive for freedom. That is true, and I hadn't thought about it that way.
There has been this unbelievable sea change in particularly American culture, I would say, but globally too. But Americans especially, I think, have always really rebelled against censorship. Even the idea that they could be warned about certain kinds of speech, they didn't like that. If you go back to the Parents Music Resource Center controversy in the 80s, which I remember. So I think what's going on, and the more I look at it, in parallel to this censorship program, I think what they're doing with things like shadow banning and denial listing is they're trying to simplify controversies and reduce everybody's intellectual field of view, and in doing so kind of drain our will to be curious, to stand up for ourselves, to think about things in a complicated way, and it's making us, less interested in standing in fighting for our rights. I think that's part of internet culture now. They're kind of draining our the fighting spirit out of us.
Just something that occurs to me. Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message, right? And I'm wondering how much the particular whole new way of communicating that we're in, like it or not, is affecting that, because you're describing an assault on the American spirit here, right? Like a very deliberate one, but at the same time, there's something with this technology that's possibly, right, that's also playing a role.
Absolutely. And I've been covering internet censorship issues since 2018. I was one of the first people in quote-unquote mainstream media to worry about it in the States. One of the first things I was told is that social media is addictive in the same way that cigarettes are addictive. There are studies about it. The companies have done studies talking about how people get dopamine hits even from feeling, for instance, the waffle pattern on the back of their phones. They are addicted to the whole process of looking at their phones. And the problem with internet culture is that it's very anti-individualistic. If you talk to younger people, kids in school, their whole sense of self-worth is wrapped up in how many likes they're getting, how many impressions they're getting on social media. They can't measure the worth of their own personalities with absent, sort of group approval, which is, I think, very contrary to the American spirit, right? We've always been people who, we go off on our own, and as I mentioned in the speech yesterday, like Chuck Berry, with no particular place to go. We never had to think about how we fit into the crowd as much as we do now. And I think the internet culture is so wraps up everybody so much in group affirmation that it's been very harmful.
So the thing that I've been obsessing over the last, as my viewers know, over the last 6 months, at least, if not longer, is this idea that as human beings, when we perceive that there's a consensus view on any issue, on some issue, that influences us incredibly. Whether or not it's actually true that that consensus view exists, there's also powerful mechanisms that can create the perception of consensus. And you said, you said earlier they're doing something. I want to find out who you think they are, right? But some of them have these tools. But some of this is also an emergent property as well, exactly like you just described, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the one hand, it's classic herd behavior. It's the same mechanism, that causes, as soon as 50% of a herd of deer decide to go one way, they all go, right? Sometimes people behave in the same way. What I've always struggled with is in journalism, we're trained, or we used to be trained, to think in the opposite way. That when everybody goes one way, like, that is often a red flag that something's up. Maybe you should look in the other way. I think the business now, at least in the media business, it's frowned upon to cross consensus now. The stars of our business and mainstream media are all people who go along with the consensus view of things, and it's very, very frowned upon to raise questions about things that have quote unquote been decided, and I worry a lot about that. I think that's true in academia as well. I've seen this in newsrooms. Newsrooms used to be a place where people had all kinds of opinions. People behaved like, it was the dressing room of a comedy club. Now everybody's nervous. They don't want to tell you what they really think about things, and that's just a terrible atmosphere for this kind of job, because you need to have that spirit of free inquiry in order to get to the truth, even in this job, which is less important than some others, I think. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a very complicated thing, and I hate to be one of those back in the day types, but it wasn't that long ago that journalists really didn't gang up on other journalists unless they screwed up, unless they made a big factual mistake that got everybody in trouble. So that's why there was a lot of negative attention thrown at Judith Miller. Now, a lot of other people deserved it, and I think it was unfair that she was the only person who was vilified in that instance. But that was really the only exception once upon a time. And then, somewhere around the late Obama years, and then definitely once Trump got elected, there became this new phenomenon where journalists were willing to become this sort of consensus enforcement mechanism, which I hadn't really seen, as aggressively before. There was a little bit of it during the Iraq War, but there was always a minority of people who were allowed to give their views, and they weren't hounded out of the business really, but that became a thing. It was very noticeable. I think the incident you described was an early one, and then it became very overt during Russiagate.
What is it that made you realize that something was off? Some people have said, you're just a pro-Russia guy. That's why you went after this, right? No, I'm just kind of curious about your motivation. How did all this happen, right? Yeah.
Well, first of all, that's funny because although I am very much a Russophile. I went to Russia because I was a great lover of Russian literature. I wanted to learn to read, Gogol and Tolstoy and some other people in Russian. I love a lot of things about Russian culture. I was definitely not a fan of Vladimir Putin. I mean, some of the journalists who were murdered in the early 2000s were colleagues of mine. One of them was kind of a mentor of mine, as a matter of fact. We wrote very critically about Putin, and my newspaper, The Exile, was eventually shut down by the Russian government after I left. So we were certainly not fans of Vladimir Putin, and that was never a thought in my head about this story. Nor was any kind of affinity for Donald Trump part of my thinking about this. The real problem was that I was looking at the way they were reporting the story, and I was recognizing the same kinds of language that we saw in the WMD affair, where it was a lot of people talking about anonymous sources, referring to things that could not be independently confirmed by other reporters. So it's like science. If you can't reproduce the experiment in the lab, you got to be a little bit nervous about it. And I thought, this is a really big story to be risking so much on. And at first, all I said, very gently in places like MSNBC, was we have to be careful of stories like this. We don't have a whole lot of proof to go on. And that was the last time I was ever on MSNBC for a while anyway. And but there was this instant condemnation from people within the business that was totally new to me. I had never experienced that before.
2023, the 10th MTV International.
And one of the parts of the law was that the government cannot actively propagandize the population, especially the intelligence services. They have to be out of that business. But there were some exceptions, like things like Smokey the Bear, right? Public service messaging. They were allowed to do that. And what we found is that they've been gradually rolling back those restrictions. And instead of Smokey the Bear now we have, we were sort of joking that now we have consensus koala, which is you must think the way everybody else thinks. And if the FBI, and especially the FBI's counterintelligence division, which is very heavily involved with overseas intelligence, the CIA, DARPA, believe it or not, which you would only ever once read about in conspiracy theory literature, it's really here in the Twitter files. We ran into them over and over again. All of these agencies that were once involved with counter-proliferation, counter-terrorism, trying to counter messaging to disaffected young Muslim men in foreign countries, they are now turning all of those techniques inward on our own populations and trying to get them to believe in a different kind of political consensus. Instead of don't join Al-Qaeda, now they're saying don't vote for Donald Trump, or don't join the Canadian trucker protests, or don't join the Yellow Vest movement. It's actually not a left or right thing. It's just stay in the safe place, stay with consensus. And this is a real thing. This is something that we're observing. We see the outlines of it in Twitter files, but I think if we dig deeper, we're going to find out that there's much more to it. An example that we found in the Twitter files was Dr. Jill Stein. She's in the Green Party, and she was put on what Twitter called a deny list. An algorithm decided that she had too many views that were in sync with what they decided was Russian propaganda. So she was put into a group that was called is_Russian, and she was de-amplified. So now if you're going to look for Jill Stein's posts, it's harder to find it. And this is the new technology of speech in America. You can dial people all the way up to everybody sees it, and you can dial someone else down to it's almost impossible to see them. And that is extremely dangerous. And it's especially dangerous if It's done in secret, and nobody knows exactly how it operates, and so we only have the faintest outlines of it. But I think overall, you're right. The story is information operations that we did all around the world forever have now come home.
I'm very aware of incredibly sophisticated information operations coming out of communist China. I understand it's the same that's coming out of Russia. I see people being impacted by these things in, I think, very negative ways. It makes sense to try to counter those things. It makes sense for the government, to me, to counter those types of things. However, however, it doesn't make sense at all for the government to be, as you pointed out in your, it's Hamilton 64, 68. Hamilton, I keep going back to 1984. Hamilton 68, right? You can't use that on the local population for things like someone gets to decide what is pernicious, what is the thing that is a real threat to the population. And I think these things, I think they actually need to exist in some form, but we've seen that it's turned into something it was never meant to, or do they even need to exist? These are the kinds of things that I'm struggling with, but we have to be able to deal with this question, right?
First of all, I think it's a very difficult question, but I agree with you that if the Russians are creating a bot network and are trying to influence elections, and I was surprised during the Twitter files to learn that this was going on to a degree that was at least a little bit more broad than I had thought. Same thing with China, same thing with Iran. But the problem that I saw involved, it was best exemplified by a report by an agency called the Global Engagement Center, which is under the State Department. And it was very similar to the Hamilton 68 story. The Global Engagement Center did old school intelligence work to identify a series of accounts as, in their assessment, being actually Russian accounts, right? But in addition, they created another category they called the information ecosystem of Russia. So these were people who were quote unquote innocents, but whose views coincided with the Russian bot or the Russian account. And so let's get rid of them too. And that's where I think it gets dangerous, is because, if you think about a channel like RT, what is RT going to cover? RT is naturally going to cover all the things that are really wrong with America, right? They're going to pick out all the things that we actually want to sweep under the rug. Do they have a nefarious reason for doing it? Yes, probably. But there are people who are going to watch those programs, and there are journalists who are going to appear on that channel, like Chris Hedges, who are doing it because they are really worried about those issues. You can't just wipe all that stuff out just because the Russians want to highlight it. And that's where I think there's disagreement, up high on this stuff. It's always going to be a balancing test for these carriers, these companies, because they all know what's going on. The question is, how much are they going to clean up? At some point, if they clean up too much, then the conversations become too stilted, and it becomes harder for them to make money, and they don't stay in business, and then the tool is useless to everybody because it's either banned outright, the way some of the American platforms are in Russia now, or it's just infested with intelligence agents, which is what's going on in the West. I don't know. I don't know exactly what to do, but I do know that you can't willy-nilly remove people from platforms just because they happen to have views that coincide with some foreign power.
I think we have our work cut out for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any final thoughts, Matt? It's such a pleasure to have you. I can tell. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for having me, and I just want to say, this is the core issue around which we're going to litigate how much freedom people are going to be allowed to have in the digital age. Are we going to tightly regulate the way people think, or are we going to allow them to be free thinkers, as we did very briefly in the West, as an aberration in history, right? So this is an inflection point that may turn out later to be like a crucial moment in the intellectual history of people, and I hope it comes out the right way, because I think it's very scary.
As do I. Well, Matt Taibbi, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you so much. Thanks for